Washington Post. It was this long article about a young lady who had decided to attend a rally and voice a protest. She was a college student, and I found it interesting that her protest was scheduled not for her college campus, where debate used to occur, but at a political rally. Interestingly, she had decided on a Trump rally as the site of her protest. The article purports to highlight the one-on-one conversation she was having with herself vis-a-vis her plan for the protest. Her self-to-self dialogue contains segments of the usual uninformed socio-political elements utilized by people who are unfamiliar with the facts of the status quo versus history. Upon arriving at the Trump rally, she mingled with the crowd, took her seat, and waited until Mr. Trump began his speech. At that point, she jumped up, moved to the aisle, and began to shout, "Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter." She said, quote, "People began to yell back at me, 'All lives matter, get out of here.' I wanted to tell them that of course all lives matter, but that they weren't dealing with the same struggles black people were. Police brutality, an unfair justice system, generational poverty. The fact is that our country has ignored our problems for too long," end quote. And Kinchloe says, "Well, I had to reread that paragraph a couple of times to be sure I was reading it correctly." Unfortunately, there is some truth to the phrase, ignorance is bliss. And then listen to this point that Kinchloe starts to make. As a, quote, colored, then a, quote, Negro, then Afro-American, which became African-American, and now black citizen of the United States, I could only shake my head in disbelief. The sad truth is this student had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. At the risk of being labeled out of step, I could not help but be reminded of some hard facts regarding her assessment of, as she says, quote, the struggles of black people. Here she was in a public arena filled mostly with white folks, exercising freedom of assembly and speech, guaranteed to all Americans, where she was yelling, "Black Lives Matter." Back in the day, when I was her age, there was a significantly different set of realities. First of all, I would not have been allowed in the type of meeting she was attempting to disrupt. Let's stop right there for a minute. This is a great point that Kinchloe is making. When he was her age, when he was college student age, he wouldn't have even been allowed to attend an event and sit among a bunch of white people because of segregation. Anyway, he goes on. I would not have been allowed in the type of meeting she was attempting to disrupt. Blacks were not allowed when I was her age in the same public arenas as whites, or in the same schools from primary to university, at the same lunch counters, juvenile delinquent facilities, mental hospitals, even cemeteries were segregated. There was one bright spot on the horizon, however. We could, as true believers in Christ, be united in heaven. Because then we would all be washed whiter than snow. Yes, someone actually said that to me years ago. But her cry at the Trump rally was, "Black Lives Matter." So my question is, to whom? I could not help but wonder why she was not marching or demonstrating in front of a Planned Parenthood center. If Black Lives Matter, why are 78% of Planned Parenthood clinics located in minority communities? If Black Lives Matter, and blacks make up only 13% of the population, why do they account for 35% of all abortions in America? Since 1973, more than 15.5 million blacks have been killed by abortion. According to Irma Clardy Craven, social worker and civil rights leader, now deceased, she said, quote, several years ago when 17,000 aborted babies were found in a dumpster outside a pathology laboratory in Los Angeles, California, of the 17,000 aborted babies, between 12 and 15,000 of them were observed to be black, end quote. As a side note, the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, was a devout racist who created the Negro Project designed to sterilize unknowing black women. Margaret Sanger said, quote, colored people are like human weeds and are to be exterminated, end quote. But Black Lives Matter. Kinchloe goes on to say. He then points out, according to FBI data, more than 1,400 black Americans murdered other black Americans in 2 years. Murdered more black Americans in 2 years than were lynched by whites from 1882 to 1968, the entire time frame of lynching. Let me say that again. According to FBI data, more than 1,400 black Americans murdered more black people in just 2 years that were lynched in the entire era of lynching, all the way back to 1882. In 2012 alone, black males, who represent only 6.6% of the population, committed a staggering 5,531 murders in 2012 alone. In other words, black people, at just a fifth the size of the population, committed almost 1,000 more murders than their white counterparts. And he says, let's just take one example. There have been almost as many deaths in Chicago as there have been in the two major wars carried out by the U.S. military this century, as this city's death toll is almost equal to that of both wars of Iraq and Afghanistan combined. And can I remind you, folks, the overwhelming majority of those deaths are black people. Those are black lives that were lost. Do those black lives matter? Kinchloe goes on. Department of Justice statistics show that between 1980 and 2008, black people committed 52% of homicides. It would take cops 40 years to kill as many black men as died at the hands of other blacks in 2012 alone. University of Toledo criminologist Dr. Richard Johnson examined the latest crime data from the FBI's supplementary homicide reports and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and found that an average of 4,472 black men were killed by other black men annually between January 1st, 2009 and December 31st, 2012. In 2013, blacks, 12% of the population, committed 38% of the murders, while whites, the overwhelming majority of the population, accounted for just 31% of the murders. So Black Lives Matter to whom? Seems to me our college student was demonstrating in the wrong neighborhood. Now, folks, Ben Kinchloe is a black man. He used to host the 700 Club with Pat Robertson. I don't think Ben Kinchloe's point here is to say, look how bad the criminals are in the black communities. That's clearly not the point that he's making here. And I certainly don't think he's trying to say, well, look how bad black people are, because look at how disproportionately higher the crime rates are among black people than white people. And look how many more black people commit crimes and murder compared to white people. I don't think Ben Kinchloe, a black man, is trying to argue, hey, I got a real problem with black people. No, not at all. What he's saying is he has a real problem with the Black Lives Matter movement when the Black Lives Matter movement seems to be ignoring the overwhelming majority of black lives that are lost in a politically incorrect way to point out. Because, you see, it's politically incorrect. It speaks against liberalism to highlight the black lives lost through abortion. It speaks against liberalism to highlight the black lives lost in black neighborhoods where crime is running rampant. It's politically correct to make the police the bad guy. It's politically incorrect to make the criminals in the poor neighborhoods and crime-ridden neighborhoods the bad guys. That's politically incorrect. And so what you do is put on blinders to the fact that their victims also happen to be black. This is the point Kinchloe is making. That the Black Lives Matter, not only is the response to Black Lives Matter that, well, all lives matter, what I'd like to see the Black Lives Matter movement do is start to say, all black lives matter. Yes, all lives matter. I agree with that. But can we at least find a compromise where they'll be willing to say all black lives matter? Or do only some, just a small, tiny sliver, do only less than 1% of the black people that die at the hands of police, are those the only black lives that matter? What about the other over 99% of black lives that are lost, that through a politically incorrect means, do those black lives matter? That, to me, is the point Ben Kinchloe is making. I think it's a very fair point. You're listening to The Bob Duco Show.